Hello, Stephen, and thank you for giving me your time. It's an honor to be talking to you, and I'm hoping that this talk will help many people who will watch this to gain more understanding of both of these uh, approaches and their principles.
Well,
Yeah,
thank you, Ashka, for organizing it. You know, we're quite far away in the world, and it's wonderful
yeah,
to that you've taken the time and effort to do this. So
it's
thank you.
a privilege. Thank you. So, Stephen, would you please say a bit about your background? And you've been in both of those communities for a long time. Maybe you want to say how you got involved in each of them, and and then I will ask how each of those contributed to your work.
I have the long and short version of this. See if I can come up with a medium version for you.
Yeah.
Background that is all in psychology came. I was a math and engineering major, and
Mm.
kind of back in high school, you know, when they had uh, the Flintstones, uh, if you know that joke, back in those days when we had pet dinosaurs, I was uh, I was a math whiz, and in high school they even made there were three of us, and they made special courses to study Markov chains and matrix geometry and so on, way back in high school.
Mm.
So I went into college majoring in engineering and math, but mostly engineering. I was because I couldn't see a career otherwise in math. And I, at one point, had a psychology class, and the woman who taught it, um, she was the wife of the head of the Department of Psychology at Michigan State University. And boy, I really was impressed. She had answers to questions about things that I had never even asked, things I hadn't thought about.
Mm.
And I thought, wow, this is engineering and math are pretty straightforward. You know, you memorize a formula
Yeah.
and you apply it, and you know, presto changeo, mass times velocity, you know, or divided by, you know, gives you energy.
Yeah.
And so she had things that I never thought. I was very fascinated. So I switched my major, and I majored in anthropology and psychology and linguistics, and graduated with actually with four majors. It took me a long time to get out of undergraduate school, and then I went to. I was, of course, working to put myself through college, and one of the things I did was working with youth on the street who needed a great deal of help sociologically and psychologically.
Kind of a
And
social work, right?
yeah, yeah, outreach program is called outreach, and I had run across this crisis intervention center because that teacher pointed out that they were looking for volunteers. So I went to apply as a volunteer, and was taken in the early training, one of the early training groups, third training group, and I began volunteering. There was quite a bit of training that had to do with empathy skills and listening skills, and how to handle depression on the telephone and people that were suicidal. And that was just fascinating because it was a part of what I had chosen now as a new direction, but I didn't know what therapy was about. I just knew crisis intervention, and I knew theory. And you know, and of course you're studying theory of perception and things that aren't really very helpful for psychotherapy and the
Practically, yeah.
direct application. So anywho, now we're going, and I'm looking for a graduate program that's going to have a lot of contact with people in the training. And the PhD programs back in those days were all referred to as pigeon labs and rat labs, or you know, they were experimental psychology. There was hardly any clinical program.
Mm.
There were a couple, but I'd have to relocate and give up my employment. Now there were some I wasn't even sure I could become accepted in. And so I went to, but one of the things I heard about was the MSW program, Master's Degree in Social Work. And they had a total immersion with people the whole time. There was no studying pigeons and, no rat labs. And so there wasn't this, you weren't writing your dissertation on, on reinforcement theory
Yeah,
so
the behavioral.
yes, and operant behavioral approach was quite big in that. Right around that time, humanistic psychology had taken a huge blow to its popularity because B.F. Skinner was now promoting behaviorism. And so we lost values, and we lost emotion, we lost cognition, we lost interpersonal behavior, and it all became reinforcement contingencies on behavior. And I thought, wow, this is not what I want to learn. I want to go ahead and continue learning what I was. Now, while I was in these last 2 years of graduate school, or undergraduate school, last year and a half of undergraduate school, and I was reading all of the psychology. I was reading Gestalt therapy. I was reading other people too. Ira Progoff, and of course, all the things I had to read, which was Freud and Sullivan and Adler. And one of the things that I did at that time was hunt for some Gestalt training. And I started going to Gestalt marathons that I could go to in another city in Michigan. And I had to go to Detroit for these weekends. And the woman who ran them was so creative. It was unbelievable. So we talked to each other about going together to see Fritz Perls. And well, turns out he died on me before we went. So I started looking for a training program that was in Ann Arbor, where I lived, and Michigan. And there was a Gestalt TA program. I'd read a little about transactional analysis, but not anything more than the superficial part that most people learn about from books in the airport,
Yeah.
And so I didn't know about second order structure, and I didn't know about script theory and those kinds of things, which turned out to be fantastic pieces of learning. So I signed up for this. I had to take out a loan, the first loan I'd ever taken out on my own, other than a school loan, which of course all happens behind the scene. You don't magically know how that happens. And so I'm going, and the first day that I sit there was the second year of the program. And Willem says, this was kind of a redecision, this is a redecision oriented training, because he had worked closely with Willem, with Goulding. And so he says, who wants to be the therapist? As the very first, welcome everybody, sit down, who wants to be therapist? And all the people who'd been there for a year, who were already professionals, I'm probably the only one that's not, they all sat on their hands. And I said, well, I will. I'm paying plenty of money that I don't have, so I'll be the therapist. Because at this point I had read everything you could read in Gestalt therapy at the time. And I had read a pretty good amount of TA at this point as well, but not the more deep books, but still you could cover a lot of material without finding out that there were, Hamowitz had a book, and you didn't know that back then. And so I sat down in the chair, and I said, who wants to be the client? And this woman pops up, who's a social worker, sits in the chair. Now, at this point, I had already gone into my first year of graduate school. And so I'd been studying, but now I'm in a training program and in graduate school, but that's all. And the graduate school is University of Michigan. On the one hand, there was a behavior modification track with well-known professors. And on the other hand was a psychodynamic track with well-known But and now and then there was a little bitty thing. There was a group therapy thing that was actually taught by Cartwright of Cartwright and Zanders of fame, who, if you know group therapy, you know Yalom's name and you know
Yeah.
Cartwright and Zander. That this was Cartwright and Zander. And so we had some pretty high level professors there. Dick Stewart, who had operant interpersonal marital therapy, which I don't think you hear much about anymore, but he was there. In fact, in my second year, I taught a course with him together because he and I talked about transactional analysis, and he realized this was a beautiful
Model.
parallel to his operant interpersonal. Stroke theory was a perfect fit for his operant interpersonal marital therapy. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So now my client is sitting in the chair. She says, you remind me of my brother a little bit. So I pull up an empty chair and I said, well, imagine your brother sitting in the empty chair and telling me you've been thinking about him lately. And within a minute, she is sobbing in another language. And I don't know what she's talking about. But she, shit, I don't know what to do. And so I look up at Dr. Willems, the leader, and he says, what's the second rule of communication? I don't know if he said what, I think he just said the second rule of communication. And so for him, it was probably a test to see how much I knew. But since I knew, I said, Kristen, precisely how much money would you estimate you've accumulated in your checking account in your best approximation? What? And I said it again. She clearing up her tears, and she's saying, you want me to tell you how much money in my checking account? And I said, no, not really. I just wanted you to get in your adult ego state so you could explain to me what's happening in front of us here. And it turns out that when she was 4, I think it was, her brother had purposely put her hand on a hot stove and burned her fingers. And she had flashed back to that. And so now moving ahead a little bit here to forgetting about the rest of that therapy for a second. So on the one hand, we've got the behavior mod people saying regression is not real or something, or if it happens, it's compliance on the part of the client. I'm not quite sure fully what their complaint was about that. But on the other hand, I've got the psychodynamic people at the University of Michigan saying behavior modification is all superficial and all baloney. It's not really as powerful as regression in service of the ego and building up ego strength. And I'm saying, whoa, wait a minute, guys. Let's take this client as an example. That was a true regression. And how we handle that would be building up her, or flubbing it up, or help her ego strength, depending upon how, I reacted to that. How therapy went. And on the other hand, the reason I could get her out of it to explain it to me was her conditioned response to those big words that I was using. Call it adult ego state, but that adult ego state was the result of conditioned response to the stimuli of polysyllabic words like precisely estimate the accumulation of money. And so you're both right, but you're both wrong in thinking the other guy is wrong. And so that was my education for the next 2 years before I graduated. And as I came out of that on the other side, I, like I had mentioned, was doing a great deal of reading that was not assigned reading. And I was thinking, I want to go meet Eric Berne then. I couldn't meet Fritz Perls. Well, Eric Berne died, of course, as well, by the time I looked into that. So I thought, well, the next old timer that I come across, I'm going to go see that guy before he dies. And I was reading. I'd been reading the books from the Mental Research Institute, MRI, in that Gregory Bateson, Jay Haley, Waswick, Weeks, and Jackson communication researchers
Mm.
had put in place, and the double bind theory of schizophrenia, of course, which I had to read in graduate school, and that's how that got me interested in their works. Well, they kept footnoting Milton Erickson. In fact, that's footnoted a great deal in the double bind theory, in the article Towards the Theory of Schizophrenia, which is about the double bind theory. So I thought, well, it's too bad I couldn't study with. There had been a book I read back in high school, the only psychology book, and it was by Jay Haley, and it was called Strategies of Psychotherapy. And the story of why I read it was because a dream I had, and the librarian said, go read psychology book and it'll help you. And it didn't help me, but I read this little book because it was readable. It was otherwise I was reading these big volumes that I couldn't understand. And because I was in engineering and math, I didn't know what schizophrenia was. So when I saw the book Arrietty's Theory of Schizophrenia, whatever it's called, Towards the Theories, I don't know what it was called now, but I didn't know the word schizophrenia. I certainly hadn't heard of Arrietty, whoever that was. And but here was this little bitty book called Strategies of Psychotherapy by Jay Haley, and I thought, well, I'll read that then, but it didn't help. But it introduced this guy who was in the autumn of his years, or the winter of his years, named Milton Erickson. So when I saw that the years later now, when I'm actually in psychology and I see Erickson's name, I didn't know he was alive. Meanwhile, though, I met Gregory Bateson because he started the MRI and had pulled these people together that wrote these books and did that research. So I met, he lives in Santa Cruz, and I was at his house, but I think in Santa Cruz at one point, but I believe we were in Colorado together in Aspen, and I was having lunch with him. And I was talking about whether or not children are following post-hypnotic suggestions from their parents, because Burns said that it's as if the parents were inadvertent hypnotists of the children. And R.D. Lang said that the children were following the directives of their parents unwittingly, who were following the directives of their parents. Another R.D. Lang, who didn't even cite Eric Berne at all in any of his works, was talking about script theory as well. And so I mentioned this to Bateson, who is a big family therapy communication expert. And he said, you should go ask Milton Erickson about that question. And I said, yeah, I wish I'd have met him before he died. And Bateson almost swallowed his sandwich without chewing it.
And he said he's alive.
Yeah, well, I thought he was alive. I didn't know he was dead. And then he realized, he said, no, he's alive. If he had died, I would have heard about it. He's alive in Phoenix, Arizona. Reach out to him and contact him and go see him. So when I contacted Erickson and said, I'm familiar with your work through Jay Haley and Gregory Bateson said to call you, and Erickson accepted, and I went to see him. Now there's another part, one little teeny tiny extra part. The reason I was interested in the first place in Gestalt, and then in TA, and then in Erickson, is because each of these had a less negative view of the human being than many of the other things we had studied. Like you go back to analysis, for example, and then even what follows in ego analysis, ego psychology, you're using words like defense and attack and oppression and suppression. These are all military concepts, military metaphors, and they carry a certain weight and a certain in interpretation that you're attacking yourself. There's some part of you must be kind of the enemy or something. You're defending against yourself. There's something oppressing you, and holy crap, that's all pretty negative. But you didn't see that from Fritz Perls. You saw moving into the foreground being kept into the background. You didn't see that in transactional analysis, except you did see this one little teeny tiny not okay adapted child part. And but Erickson didn't even have that. Erickson, had erased all theory about personality, and he didn't have any
Yeah.
of that baggage. So he was even a little bit more positive about his view of the human being. And in fact, if you read everything he writes, you find out that he said that, gosh, I can't remember what it was. It was like 1/10,000th of the unconscious, I think, is what he says at one point. Don't quote me on this, but a very small part of the unconscious mind is actually acting in a way which is contrary to your better interest. A very small part of your personality has learned to, stop necessary organic organismic self-regulation that you need. And he had a very positive view of people. And so I was drawn to each of those therapies were quite attractive because of that quality. And so that becomes, so now I start studying with Erickson from 75, and I quit being a provisional teaching member at that point. So I'd studied TA from officially from with training programs and money from 72 to the end of 75. So for about 4 years almost. And then I started contacting Erickson in 75 and studied with him regularly until December of 79. And he died within 3 months of my last visit. When I would go see him, it was, I had a job where I had unbelievable time. I had four 3-day, what am I trying to say? 4 5-day vacations and 1 3-day workshop that were all paid for. So I had 4 weeks during the year, and really 5 if you count those other 3 days, where I could, and my parents lived right down the road from Erickson in Phoenix, a little city called Sun City. So I'd travel from Michigan to stay with my parents, drive their car, their food, their telephone. They really helped a lot.
Nice.
And then I could see Erickson every 3 months for the weekends, minus the travel day. So I could either see him for 7 days straight, or and fly home, in the midnight, or I could see him for 5 days or 6 days, or so I got to see him for sometimes 8 days straight. And other days he was too ill and I could only be there 3 days before I had to not see him anymore. But every 3 months. And I would come back to Michigan and practice with my patients what I'd learned. And by the time a couple months and 2.5 months had passed, I was beginning to feel like I'd lost the inspiration. I'd lost the intuition somehow.
And then you come back and visit him.
And I'd come back and get another injection of him. I'll tell you a parallel story, which you may not actually believe, because if you haven't had the experience. When I was in East Lansing as an undergraduate, I was involved in the music scene there. And so I would help. So when people came to town, they'd sometimes contact me, what other places could they sing, and who was the contact. And there was this group of 2 singers, jazz singers, called the Pair Extraordinaire. And one of them sang, otherwise he sang a cappella, but his partner played stand-up bass, and they played jazz vocal songs. This guy sang so well that after being with him for the couple nights that they performed, I could sing way better. And it was like the guy opened up I don't know what the hell happened, but you modeled after him, or if you want to get mystical, he kind of opened up your throat chakra or something. And you could sing for a while, but after a few weeks it would fade and I'd be back to my own regular voice. But it was a parallel to this Erickson story, that once you were with him, you had a much more saturation of confidence about how to proceed. So
and then
that's my background.
like an interject, carrying him with you.
Well, so that's my background in those things. But I got to say that of all the training and readings that I did, and there's a lot of it. The books behind me are the small section of my library. The big section's in the another room that we call the library, and I pretty much read the collected works of everybody, except I didn't read all of Jung. He's got too many,
Mm.
and but I like what he's got to say. It's interesting, but the especially aspects about collective unconscious, you got to wonder how brilliant ideas emerged in two different people
Yeah.
at the same time, like the thermometer and the the magneto and things like that. But anyway, so
So, uh,
my TA training, I think, was the best because the understanding of script is so fucking brilliant. Pardon my language here, but the idea that uh, the interjections from everyone, like some people, most everybody acknowledges their interjections from
mm,
parents, like Sullivan pointed out, Adler pointed out, and that kind of saturates in. People know that, even dynamic oriented even Freudian people
mm,
understand that, and even though interpersonal was not acknowledged much, but the understanding that shapes your personality, that shapes your communication to your own children, or that there's transpersonal defense mechanisms that you use those on, that's pretty well lost, and it's a shame because it is probably one of the most important aspects of psychology, that social psychology aspect, social psychiatry aspect that Byrne brought.
yeah, yeah. Well, what is interesting for me, as you mentioned, the difference and contrast of theories, is that, as you said, Milton Erickson erased all the theories. He didn't have a structured theory of psychotherapy and even psychopathology. But on the other hand, in TA, we have lots of theories and we have lots of structures and everything. And having both of them in your mind when working and now seeing people, how is that for you? And how do you combine those and integrate them?
Yeah, one Erickson did have, if you uh, trace his uh, understanding of problems in the 70s, he was saying that problems are the breakdown of
Mm,
communication between people, and it's breaking down. Now, he didn't elaborate, which I think he would have said that the breakdown of that communication means that you don't get your needs met, that you don't
mm,
get the expression of things that need to be recognized and stroked. Certainly, that's the implication. Prior to that, though, he started out saying that problems were the result of the
rigidity.
anxiety was the result of just like in analytic theory, that the anxiety is the result of needs breaking through the defense mechanism, trying to break through the defense mechanism, and the defense breaking down creates the anxiety. And so he was educated clearly with the traditional view of neurosis back in the day when he was educated, and he kept it with him. So he did have a little bit of uh, and he certainly had a topographical understanding of the personality, that there's a part of you that's driving you around that's called the unconscious, and then there's the conscious mind. And he wrote a great deal about depotentiating the conscious mind, that that people would have the resources that they need to solve problems, except that the conscious mind doesn't know how to bring them into the foreground, or into consciousness was his word. And that depotentiating the conscious mind so that you could, with hypnosis, bring the needed resources into the foreground, was his goal. That the cure was a matter of reassociating experiential resources.
Mm,
That's his
mm,
quote. And so that's kind of the same as saying that you've got needs, primarily child ego state needs, that you can't, and learnings that you can't get into the foreground because if you use TA theory, adaptations, I mean, the adapted child has said, I cannot show this fear to my mother or father because it's unacceptable. You don't particularly remember thinking it out. Maybe you didn't think it out, but you did learn that bad things will happen.
Yeah.
If I get, there'll be a bigger threat to my survival, or I won't, I'll get actually punished or something. So I'm going to keep that fear down. And Erickson would consider that a resource. The fears, Pearls would consider it part of organismic self-regulation, that you need to express it, and then the gestalt will change and things will be wonderful again somehow. He was a little optimistic perhaps, but Erickson Byrne would say you need to express that fear and own it as part of yourself, so that you're understanding that that part of you, that child, is okay, and have a route that you can express it in a socially appropriate manner with protection of your parent ego state. And Erickson would say that that's a resource that you need to have in this particular circumstance, so that you're understanding that fear is something that alerts you to the behavior that you need to have, like moving away or protecting yourself, or somehow, but not doing what you're doing instead of the fear. Your conscious mind is a barrier to thinking that if I show this fear, they'll think I'm weak, or if I show the, And so Erickson was, and I brought a couple TA books to Milton as a gift when I first visited him. And he said, how did you know that I had an affection for transactional analysis and Eric Berne's work? So I don't see much of a, oh yeah. I don't see much of a barrier between linking these things together. The barrier seems to be mostly in the mind of the theorist who wants to defend his or her territory, and say, no, they're wrong, I'm right. We need to look at it my way. But they're all talking about the human being and the human interpersonal experience. So each of them has some truth to them that they figured out. I just see them all hooked together quite nicely. And I do think in terms of script theory, a lot of times when I'm working with somebody in hypnosis, even like, how in the world did you get this way? That this is what you can't do anymore, that you need to do. And so that gives us in hypnotic interventions of for one thing, rehearsing in trance, that just like you would do in a double chairing technique in Gestalt therapy, perhaps.
Lots of things that are coming to my mind, and I like to ask. So, but now as I understand it, you say the theory that maybe we can say what Milton Erickson said about the breakdown of communication between child and parent is like those negative experiences of the that are stored in child ego state, or what Richard Erskine talks about relational needs and losing contact with internal needs for the child, and then those having those effects on the personality. And then in practice, when Eric Berne thinks about gaining or raising awareness in the adult ego state, you see it somehow similar to bringing things from unconscious to the conscious, and setting aside the barriers, right? And with hypnosis, and you use hypnosis as a tool to do this experientially, right?
Yes. So you could look at it from any particular ego state, that there are aspects that are learnings which would have a symbolic representation in each ego state, like a sense of, okay, so I just worked with a woman who's really worried about her husband. She and her husband are retiring. She's really worried about her husband's conduct, whether he can handle the transition. But of course, she's got her own worries, and it's easier for her to say that it's her worried about, she's worried about him. But she, you know, obviously she's projecting her anxiety and, or, you know, displacing the cause of it as his potential frailty instead of her frailty. So a solution here would certainly be if she could bring a feeling of confidence into the foreground when she thinks about her husband. In Erickson's terms, you retrieve and reassociate experience. So we're talking about retrieving the experience of confidence and reassociating it with her imagination of being with her husband in the future. Now, you could look at it from a transactional analysis standpoint and say that as a child, in fact, I did, one of the things I retrieved, help her start to retrieve when in trance was when she learned to tie her shoes, button buttons, learned the alphabet, learned to read, learned to use silverware, learn to walk. All of these early childhood learnings are humongous, monumental conquests, but we soon forget about them and worry about the fact that we can't write a chapter for a book tomorrow. Well, we've done things that are way harder than that when we were younger. And what's happening is you're not able to get those feelings of confidence into the foreground. So if you do, those are child ego state learnings, but the adult has labels for those things and a self-image that it can build with the cooperation of the child. This is, I can see myself being confident. And that means literally making pictures of myself. I might not realize I'm making pictures of myself, but if I slow down and stop, I go, oh yeah, I could see myself. I did imagine myself doing that visually, you know. And parent ego state aspects to it, which is, yeah, we are proud that you were able to walk, you were able to read, you were able to use silverware. So each ego state is involved in the acceptance of the behavior that's coming into the foreground. When Erickson says we're retrieving experiences and reassociating them. And then the only other snag is if there was some learning that really inhibited that. You know, like every time I use silverware, my mother used to slap me down because she said I was getting uppity. Because when she was a little girl, they used their fingers or something. Then you've got, you know, then you've got a learned barrier that you have to work through. But forgot what your question was. Something about ego states accepting it into the foreground.
So
did I answer the question?
And I'd like to know also about the script theory and how you do the analysis in Ericksonian framework. I mean, especially take something like game analysis, and you had a recent article at the Game Grid. I'd like to know, how is it different in Ericksonian point of view to see those maybe transactions or habits or anything like as a resource and work in a solution-oriented way as an Ericksonian way? How is it different than the traditional way of just finding maybe correction? Or I want to know which intervention in facing games Ericksonian approach would take. Would you just play the game and then stop it, or confront the game, or realize it and have an adult awareness, or gain experiential experience in games? How would you do that?
Yes, well, there's two aspects that you might want to think about. One is the therapy aspect, and the other is the management of the uh, uh, what's the word I want? I don't want to say management of therapy. I want to say management of the process of getting to the therapy,
The
the
relationship, you mean?
office behavior management.
Mm.
There's a word for it, and I'm not thinking of exactly the word I want, but uh, therapeutic management is the right word, but it doesn't convey what I want to convey. So there are many stories where Erickson would allow the person, like one of his published stories was a guy with a big swollen lip. Was if you looked in the indexes of Erickson's books and look under, depends on what versions of the books you have, but if you've got the 4 volume set, the older set of collected papers from
Mm.
Irvington publication, there's one of the volumes, I think it's volume 4, has a list of all the cases that
Mm.
are, and if you look for swollen lip, the case, you'll
Um,
find it. And anyway, the guy criticizes everything. And Erickson goes 8 weeks with this guy coming in the office and berating Erickson. And the guy would talk about how people that weren't as well educated, they were peasants. And Erickson says, I remind you that my parents were farmers. My parents were peasants. And then he would criticize Erickson for, being from a lineage of stupid peasants. And Erickson would just let it go on because it was, in Erickson's understanding of this, it's utilization technique
yeah,
that you cannot get the person to listen to your point of view until their needs are satisfied. Uh, by the way, on the eighth session, the guy suddenly realized, "Oh my God, you're not my father," he said
yeah.
spontaneously. But you don't know that it's going to end up that way. Another case, well, I guess I don't know if I should tell you mine or Erickson's. Erickson had a fellow pacing the floor, and when he came into the room, he just paced the floor. And he said, I can't go into trance because all I can do is pace the floor. That's all I can do. And Erickson's response was, now surely this is a good con to see how you're going to get hooked. If you've got a gimmick to help somebody, no matter what, you're going to get hooked in trying to help this guy not pace the floor and end up getting right into the game, right? So Erickson says, would you be willing to continue to cooperate with me?
Mm.
Note the presupposition of continue,
Yeah.
by pacing the floor under my direction.
Mm.
And the guy says, that's all I can do is pace the floor. And he says, okay, well, walk over to the left and take even an extra step. Now turn around and walk over to that wall. And now don't go all the way to the wall. Turn back to your right and walk over to this wall. Why don't you take an extra step there? Now turn around and walk back to the original wall. So now Erickson has taken charge of the behavior. From a non-combative standpoint, this guy doesn't really doesn't know how to do the things without pacing the floor. So Erickson's not asking him to drop it. Erickson's asking him to cooperate by doing more of it under his direction. And now you're passing a chair. Wouldn't it be nice if you could stop and sit in the chair? But you can't. You have to keep pacing.
Mm.
And to pass that chair again, it would be nice to sit in, but don't even think about sitting in it. And now when you pass that chair again, you could think about it, but don't sit down. You have to keep pacing. Well, wouldn't it be nice if you could sit down? Why don't you sit down for just a second, but get back up and start pacing again? And now, you were able to sit for a second. Why don't you take a break and sit for a couple minutes? And while you're sitting there, close your eyes and breathe deeply. And so now he begins his induction.
Induction. Yeah. Yeah.
But he doesn't play the game by being hooked in the usual way. He asks the person to continue what they're doing, as in the martial arts of Aikido. if somebody's trying to punch at you, you don't say, hey, why do you have to punch at everything? You say, hey, I'll take that arm and help you move.
Mm,
And then you use their energy to move them under your direction.
mm, mhm. Yeah. So we can think about every piece of the script theory and how it can be utilized in therapy to do the Ericksonian intervention.
Wait, was that a question? I thought you were, what
Yeah,
was the question?
I mean, is that right? Yeah, is it
I
what?
didn't hear the question, sorry.
Yeah, it's not a question. I mean, what I understand is that we can think about each piece of script theory or games or transactions and see how they can be utilized and how they can be worked strategically to gain to make a
Yes.
new experience, right?
Yeah, yeah. You can if the more rigid the person is, the more you absolutely have to do that, like pacing the floor.
Yeah.
But there's a continuum of how rigid people are. And so you might be able to more quickly change it into something therapeutic, like a woman who's super compliant and feels a great deal of anxiety because she's always trying to help people, has insomnia because she's thinking too much about, and her needs aren't getting met. So the utilization is quite simple. It's like, would you really be willing to help me right now by sitting down and imagining that your mother's over there in the chair if you're doing Gestalt therapy, you know? Or would you be willing to help me right now by thinking back to a time in your life when you first had the feeling that your value came from being helpful? You know, if you're asking for a rubber band to snap the person back for a redecision,
Mm.
or would you be willing to help me right now by sitting down and closing your eyes and as we begin to use hypnosis? You know, so your utilization is very simple, you know,
Yeah.
because she's not as rigid. Well, she's rigid about helping people, but she's not as radically different from normal human interaction as the guy who's pacing the floor with his rigidity.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that utilization approach is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Erickson's utilization approach.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you know, Burns' approach was to stop. Burns' approach was social
Social.
psychiatry. He wanted to stop you playing the games with your adult ego state being in charge.
Yeah.
Redecision therapy is different. It's wanting you to snap back to the time when you made the decision to eliminate certain options and choices that were useful for you and embrace them and find socially acceptable ways to express them now. So one is kind of cognitive, you know, Eric Burns' approach is pretty cognitive.
Yeah.
Goulding's approach is quite emotional. And and I got to say that I'm not quite sure why Byrne didn't, you know, come up with the redecision model instead. But yeah, so my approach is in my learning is all about the fact that the emotional version. I think that trying to do the adult ego state version is remarkably slower and sometimes maybe won't even work very well because there'll be continued barriers, you know, if you want to use the word suppression, there'll be continued suppression. I want to let you know that I'm afraid, but you know, I haven't practiced it. Well, if you don't practice it, it's hard to do, you know. So your adult can know your child's afraid, but it's not the same as your child expressing
Experience.
fear,
Yeah.
finding out that it can do that safely.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'd like to suggest for everyone who's watching this later to read your article about hypnosis in redecision therapy, because there you step by step show how Ericksonian principles and methods can be used in redecision model.
TAJ, the old
Yes,
TAJ.
the TAJ. Yeah, the TAJ.
I would have, I could write it a little better nowadays if I revisit it. But yes,
Sure.
the idea that Erickson's work was at the psychological level, and Karpman, in a 10-year anniversary review of schools of TA, he actually included the psychological level school of transactional analysis, which was my article that that while Byrne was at the social level and redecision model is at the and reparenting is at the reparenting, that I'm saying the change happened. The rationale is so simple. Byrne said that the ulterior level, the psychological level, would determine the outcome.
Yeah.
So why aren't we becoming the experts at communicating at the ulterior level? And that's what Erickson was. And that's why it's the psychological level communication that he seemed to be great at. And that's why I was trying to, in that article, even though it's kind of short, I wanted to say, look, it's the psychological level of communication that you, as a therapist, you're doing that's successful, and you need to learn that you're doing it and do it on purpose really well, so you'll be successful more often. Byrne would agree that that's the level that determines the outcome.
Thank you for this beautiful summary you gave of all of their thinkings and combining them.
Of the whole world, everything but quantum. I didn't get to quantum theory yet.
But my last question is about any suggestion you would have for new trainees and students in each of those communities. Any suggestions for reading or training or anything you want to say?
Wow. Yeah, that's important. Well, I think I've written 19 books, but I think or edited 19 books, and of the 6 I actually authored, or 7, I can't remember. But the single one, which is probably the most widely read and praised, is the book called The Answer Within. And so I would suggest that. It was mentioned at a keynote by in the last 2 years. It was still mentioned in keynotes from the American Society of Clinical Hypnosis, when the keynote speaker was different each time spoke, mentioned that book even today. And so I would say that is a great book. I think What Do You Say After You Say Hello, of course, is so rich in ideas. And then I think it might be helpful to read a couple other authors outside those fields, like R.D. Laing's Politics of Experience and Politics of the Family. Very enlightening. And I'd look at those. What else? Well, boy, training-wise, absolutely people need to be in ongoing training of redecision therapy or of some kind, I think. And as far as training in hypnosis goes, try at all costs to avoid non-professional training. Become a clinician, get a license in your state to practice, and get training from someone who is a licensed clinical practitioner. Whatever level of expertise is recognized in your area. The United States, it's different than it is in Mexico, and so on. But do make sure the person is licensed as a clinician. Because plethora of non-professional training out there, and God knows what they're teaching, and they don't have a background in psychology to know how to really apply it and be helpful to people, other than often this stupid authoritarian approach, like from a stage hypnotist or something of that nature. So do get professional training from licensed professionals if you're using hypnosis.
Very nice. Thank you so much, Steven, for giving me your time. I really, really enjoyed the talk.
Well, Ashkan, it's been really wonderful to be able to be on your side of the world and spread information that I think will be helpful to therapists, but think of the multiple clients they each see. So maybe we've helped a lot of people today. I hope so.
I hope. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Well, maybe we talk again and meet in person one day.